Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. We are about to embark on the third major part of our course. So far we've discussed arguments and their assessment, as well as issues in the philosophy of religion. This week I want to be working on, as well as next week, I want to be working on topics in ethics. This week in particular, our focus will be on utilitarianism. By way of background for the ethical doctrine known as utilitarianism, I want to introduce you to Jeremy Bentham, who was an English reformer and philosopher. His dates were 1748 to 1832. His remains are still visible at the University College London, UCL. Sometimes he's even been known to dine. Those remains are, according to the terms of his will, rolled out to a certain dining room and a special banquet, and sometimes he's put on display, such as is left of him, there for the public to view too occasionally. He was one of the earliest proponents of animal rights, and he was the founder of what is now known as utilitarianism. Now, by way of understanding what the utilitarian theory is trying to tell us, think of yourself as asking the question, I'm sure this question has come to your mind before, what makes a society just? When you feel like society, government, say, the police force, institutions that have a broad reach are doing something justifiable or unjust, what do you mean by that? In what sense are they doing things that are just or unjust? Surely it's more than just a matter of what you happen to like or dislike. There are lots of things where I wish society would do me a favor in some sense, but I don't think that it's not doing me a favor is somehow something that makes that society unjust. So where does justice or injustice come from? Now, there are a number of different philosophical traditions that try to answer that question. One of them is known as the natural law approach, and in the philosophy of natural law, there's always going to be a reference of some sort to some aspect of human nature. So if it's our nature to, for example, use our rationality, if it's our nature, for example, to love one another, or if you're a theist, if it's in our nature to, for example, love and seek union with God, that is always going to have implications for how society should be organized and how life should be carried on among human beings and possibly non-human animals as well. So the natural law approach will say such things as that our rational nature obliges us to learn something, to become educated, to gain knowledge. Or a natural law approach might say it's because of our biological features, such as, for instance, according to some, the differences between men and women and the reproductive capacities, for instance, that will give implications for how society should be organized. I'm not endorsing or refuting any of those positions. I'm just describing them in order to give you a feel for how they work. By contrast, there's also a procedural kind of approach to answering the question, what makes a society just, where the procedure refers in some sense to, in some form or another, to some mechanism by means of which people in a society settle on a conclusion about how society ought to be organized. Democratic procedures would be a case in point. If, for example, all or the majority of people within a certain society vote in favor of a certain policy, then, according to the procedural approach, that just makes it the case that that society is a just one, insofar as it implements that policy. You can imagine how this is going to be a little bit delicate, because one has to depend upon the ability of the majority of people, or all people doing the voting, to express desires that are reasonable desires. If people are sufficiently corrupt, then the danger is that the procedural approach could result in policies that are, in spite of the fact that many or most people endorse them, nevertheless unacceptable from some more general ethical perspective. By comparison and contrast with the procedural and natural law approaches, the utilitarian approach talks about something related to happiness, well-being, and describes the right society, the just society, as one in which something like well-being is maximized and possibly also distributed in a reasonably egalitarian or otherwise fair way. Jeremy Bentham offers a theory of this latter kind, in which he says the right action is the one that produces the greatest overall amount of utility, and we'll have to come and get clear on what that notion of utility is and how that is connected to right actions. So here's a quotation from Bentham. He writes, "That principle that approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. That principle, he says, is the principle of utilitarianism. It answers the question, what should I do? It's a general answer to the question, when I'm deciding what to do, how do I determine whether a certain action that I'm considering is a right action or a wrong action? Stick it into Bentham's principle, and he tells us that principle is going to give us an answer to the question. It will say, well, look at the action. Now, does it appear, we can't know for sure about the consequences of our actions, does it appear to have the ability to augment the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, for example, my own or those people that I care about? If that is the case, then that will make it an acceptable principle according to Jeremy Bentham. So the utilitarian answer to the question, what makes an act right when it's right or wrong when it's wrong, is the following. More generally now, perform that act from the acts available that has the highest overall expected utility, and as is developed by later utilitarians who are influenced by Bentham, not just utility for myself, but utility across the board. So notice that the greatest good for the greatest number is only going to be an inaccurate slogan for the general formulation of utilitarianism, although some particular utilitarians might build that in as part of their account. Because if we're talking about the maximization of overall happiness, where the notion of utility is a kind of slightly technical version of that notion, then that maximization might or might not come in the form of something that's equally distributed. We'll come back and see about how that's so in just a moment.